So in this talk, I'm going to be going through a series of scenarios, which I will put to you. These are real-life scenarios. It's based on work that I've done as an investigative data journalist. So the interesting aspect of this talk, I think, for technologists and for tech companies and for businesses is there's been a lot of noise about big data, about user data, large streams of data, which they can aggregate, which will then smooth out the outliers, and maybe try and make business decisions from. I'm looking at data at a very, very different angle. Rather than a telescopic view, my job was to look at data in a microscopic view, to tear things apart, and to wonder why the outliers were there. And maybe what we can do with joining with data, looking with data, and getting newsworthy stories and insights, particularly from them. In that sense, I'm looking more at the decisions in terms of a news story, in terms of more like business decisions. Is this analysis good enough to make business decisions on? Revenue decisions, user decisions, pivoting decisions, product decisions. But first of all, I should tell you a bit about myself, because this journey will take you through a lot of my career in the previous places I've worked. I started off actually as a broadcast journalist, TV journalist, at CNN International in London. The first story starts there. I was then awarded a Knight Mozilla Fellowship, Open News Fellowship, and embedded at The Guardian for a year. At their interactive team. I was editorial, even though Mozilla is a technology company, they actually looked at technologists, people who were interested in using computers and media to actually go into the newsrooms and work directly with the editorial journalists to try and change their eye view on how they actually do their journalism. From there, I got a job as an investigative data journalist, which is a very, very particular position. Where my beat was everything and anything that I could use a computer to get at, all digital media. From there, I have pivoted and went completely into development because of my love of computers so much, and I now currently work at ThoughtWorks, based in London. So I'm going to start this off with a story, with something that actually is a particularly strange loop. It goes from random conversations to hardcore drugs, to Twitter, to a homeless shelter, to LinkedIn, and all the way to central government. And this, again, was a loop created from sheer boredom and frustration. So I graduated from university at the worst possible time in history, at the height of the global recession. I tried to enter an industry that was contracting, and had a lot of issues with technology and advertising even before the recession. And so my first job was turning the dial of the auto cue in the news gallery. That involves doing this in semi-regular intervals, something you could train a monkey for. And you could probably now program that. I could probably now program that. But I was working part-time, and I was mostly in the news gallery. The news gallery is the back studio which runs what you would see on TV. So all the cameras, most of the time there isn't someone behind the camera. That is all on stages and all on trolleys. And that's being run electronically, as is audio, as is all the visual effects. And the audio and visual effects guys were really, really cool. They were also very, very much into music. Being into music, they're very, very much into raves and underground dance parties. Being very much into that. They were into experimenting with drug cocktails. This was something I didn't have any experience in, but I was listening to this in the news gallery. I decided I wanted to find more. I wanted to find out who were making these drug cocktails, where were they getting them from, and who was experimenting with them, and where was this market, this underground market. And so I had a computer in front of me. And I did what traditional journalists would go out and do. They would go out into the world, they would go undercover. I went undercover online. And I started 2 Twitter accounts. And with these Twitter accounts, I was basically mimicking the conversations that I were hearing. And then keywords, key drug cocktails, people would start following me. And I would start following them. And I started then building up a network of conversations of people in this underground network, underground drug network. The interesting thing that it led me to was something particular, I think, to the UK, and it spread to Europe, which is called squat parties. So to have a massive underground rave party spontaneously happen, you need a large venue, you need it probably to be abandoned, and you need to get a critical mass. You need within the first 30 minutes to probably have around 1,000 people there. You also need what's called a squat notice. You can print these out. They're legal notices that you can put onto abandoned buildings to say that you are squatting there. What that does say is that the police can't then break down the door. They have to go and get a legal permit to break the squat notice. So what they realized is that combined with a squat notice, a hell of a lot of people, a lot of noise, the local police force, so our bobbies on the beat, they don't have guns. They've got like the funny hats and like a stick. They come knocking on the door. They ain't going to do anything. They're not going to have the time. They're going to let this party burn out. And what happens is that a lot of people that go to these parties also burn out. And so I was hearing about these parties, and I was wondering how they got there. How do you manage to get a squat notice, to get sound equipment, to get a stage up, to get a full deck, and to get a hell of a lot of drugs and 1,000 people ready in 30 minutes? I knew this had to be done online. But from the conversations, there was a lot of people. I needed to talk to these people in person rather than being on Twitter. They weren't going to actually pass anything out on Twitter. So one of the conversations I heard was a guy saying, I'm completely burnt out, absolutely and completely burnt out. I need someplace quiet to stay. I can't stay at these squat parties anymore. I happened to volunteer at a homeless shelter. And so one of my Twitter accounts then sent them a message with a link to this homeless shelter. And I knew that this person also spoke French. And so I turn up at the homeless shelter, and there's two guys speaking French, looking very, very much the worse for wear. Quite young, not from the UK, mostly immigrants. Interesting backstories, I start talking to them. And the first thing one of the guy does is tell me about his crazy raves and invites me to go. He's like, give me your details, and I'll let you know when this is happening. I'll be your contact. And I basically said, you know the rules here. Can't give out my details. And so all of these people have smartphones. Everyone at Homeless Melders has a smartphone, if not an iPad. He then sends me a link. And he's like, this is a company that runs entertainment, rave entertainment, but they have a newsletter sign up. And he's like, sign up for the newsletter with not your email address, but with a phone number. Put your phone number in there, and you will get a text message. And you need to get to this place within 3 hours. That's how they do it. And so I have an email address. From an email address, I do a who is lookup. From a who is lookup, from a website, I do who is lookup, I get an email address. Get an email address of the person that owns this company. What I then do in terms of data is I want to find out more about this person. And the best place is not to go door knocking and not to pick up the phone traditional journalism, is to look on the web. So what I do have is I make an email account, a brand new Gmail account. And I put in my contacts list this email address. And with that new email account, I sign up for LinkedIn. And the first thing you do when they sign up to onboard you is, can we have access to your contacts to find your friends? It is a backdoor into their database of emails. And so this person, I find a unique identifier. This person's email is a unique identifier, and I find what this person does for a living. This person is an internet architect. He's a technologist. His side company, which I cannot name him, actually set up rave clubs, but his full-time job is an internet architect. He's an internet architect at a company, which I cannot name, but they work in bank transactions, monetary transactions, a lot of the ATM transactions that are free that go on in the UK. They also looked into the company on a company's account, or there's an open website called Open Corporates to look up more about this company. And from there, getting their unique company number, I also had previously scraped a list of government contracts. And this company is contracted by Her Majesty's Service to do the PAYE system. All of our tax system is done through the technology built by this guy. And so this is where I realized there's very interesting uses in seeding out small bits of data. That Twitter was very nascent at that time. And I was not using Twitter for what they wanted me to use. I would be an outlier in terms of their use cases, and it's not what they made their product for. The same thing with a lot of social media networks, things like LinkedIn, where they want you to onboard, come, give me your contacts, I will do an immediate lookup into my database. They probably don't like the fact that I did that, but there's probably very little that they can do. And so that kind of put me on track for using a computer better, using a computer more, learning to scrape, learning to program. And so from that, I want to go through a series of work that I've done. And I'm going to ask you, is it a bug or is it a story? And what I mean by a bug and a story is not in the sort of agile Kanban card of, oh, is this a bug in the code that we need to fix before we deploy, or is this a feature? What I mean is more the lines of, okay, is this something legitimate that you should make business decisions off, or is this a bug in the data? Because bugs in data are very, very different to bugs in code. Because there's a lot of, it mostly goes down to misinterpretation. And it usually goes down to how the data was collected or how the data was analyzed. A lot of analysis you can throw all sorts of data into, and no program will tell you you're not analyzing this correctly. They will just do the maths for you. And so let's start with probably one of the latest and the biggest stories I worked on. So if people here are into soccer, which, football, you might know of the FIFA files, which was the Sunday Times expose of the email leak from Mohammed bin Hammam for the Qatar 2020 bid. This investigation led to a series of investigations from the Times and from other papers, which recently led to the resignation of Sepp Blatter from FIFA. And I worked on these emails. They were leaked to us, but they were in the form of PDFs that were locked. And journalistically, previously they would have printed everything out and gone through things by hand. I know our lawyers actually still do that. I would just literally use PDF miner, PDF to text, unlock everything, convert everything to text, and do some text mining to from BCC and CC, and built this network diagram. The person at the very, very center of the treetop there is Mohammed bin Hammam's secretary, and the person in yellow, I cannot show you these names directly, but the person in yellow is Sepp Blatter. And I want to ask you, having done this from leaked emails from a source who I did not know the source, I did not speak to the source, other journalists did, I just had the data. Is this publishable? Is this a bug or is it a story? Should this image be published? Okay, so hands up who thinks this is a story. This is data that we have done. I have not manipulated the data. I have converted PDF to text. I have taken out names, and I've connected them with CC, BCC, to and from. Hands up who thinks it's a story. Okay, hands up who thinks it's a bug. This is actually a bug because it is one node, it is partial data. Our source, we assume, had access to a server, Microsoft Outlook server, and went into one person's account, and we don't know if they took every single email. This person cherry-picked the emails, and if you look back as well, the person is at the center because that's the person's emails that they had access to. All of the nodes on the trees, they could end up, if we get a much bigger picture and get their emails and everyone that they've emailed connected to FIFA, we could get a very, very different picture. And that is one of the big things when it comes to making decisions based on data, is the unknown unknowns. It is very, very difficult to say how much data you are losing. And with big data, they think that it's only going to be a small percentage and it's fine. But a lot of time that percentage is not known. In terms of losing data, it can also be a misinterpretation of how you got that data. So doing business intelligence for a news organization, the Times, Sunday Times is behind a paywall. So we have user accounts that they log into so we can track individual users. We have information on those users, like gender and actually like how much they earn. One point we wanted to look at what our female users were doing because we had very low volume. of female users, and then how we can make and change our content to suit them, and maybe we should have a special supplement, maybe we should have some of our female writers work on a specific section. There was a bug in the system that would not allow us to make correct decisions, which is the fact that an account for the Times Sunday Times is usually owned by the head of the family. With our consumers, they tend to be conservative, they tend to be male-dominated families. And so a woman would be logged in as her husband. The vast majority of our female users will be logged in as their husband. And then that makes different decisions. At first, we're like, well, we can't make decisions for our female users, but we can maybe look at our product and say, do we want a family login with one login but with multiple users to try and track this? Okay, this is actually from my time at The Guardian on the interactive team. This is a US-based story. This is based on the US food aid program. This was a time when the US budgets were being slashed post-recession. And they ring-fenced the US food aid budget and in Congress. And the reason why they said they ring-fenced it was because of the recession. The US food aid program is going to be used to bolster small farms and small agricultural businesses, that they're going to see a reduce in volume, and in order to survive, they're going to use the US food aid program to actually get their produce and send it abroad and therefore bolster them. So we ended up building an interactive, and we chased procurement reports to actually shipping reports. It was very interesting. We found an FTP site just with folders that was used for shipping companies to track their shipment. Because it was open, we were able to go in and get port reports of what is coming in on the container docks. From there, we tracked each food shipment and what they were back to the country from which the food aid program is being run. I want to ask you now, considering this is data across multiple websites, this is scrape data, this is data from multiple sources, this is something not necessarily provided, the government don't track this themselves. That being said, hands up who thinks this is a story, this is something legitimate that you can make decisions on for the US food aid budget. How many people think there's a bug in this? This was actually a legitimate story. And this was brought up in Congress when they debated their next budget, this particular story. The reason why this was for sure a story, is that when you're aggregating data and when you're doing things and joining sources, you need to have another metric which you can gauge against a logical value for your conclusion. That being said, they didn't track everything. They didn't track all their procurement records and who was getting the money, but they did have a US food aid budget for that year. How much are the government going to give in form of US food aid? And adding all of that up, we were within a 10% error. And that's kind of what you have to do. Whenever you're making something, whenever I'm doing on a project and doing analysis on user data, I will always say, does this make sense as a percentage considering what you know working with your user data of completion rates? I will always find another metric that will try and make some logic out of it. Another reason why this was particularly a good story and a big lesson I learned from it is we named large agribusinesses. That was the big story here, was that the US food aid that was ring-fenced for actually trying to support local businesses was just propping up large agribusinesses during the recession, and it was basically a lobbying effort. So we actually named companies. By naming companies, they came down on us hard. They threatened to sue because you also have to look for comment before we publish. The minute they knew we were publishing this, they got their lawyers onto us. Really, really large agribusinesses. And editors being editors flip out. And everyone on the investigation gets called in. A typical investigation not using a computer, probably be around 20 people in 6 months. A lot of the companies, they know if they threaten a lawsuit, we need to potentially go to court, which is being expensive. We need to show all of our work, and we need to reproduce all of our work. That is money and time intensive, which is why investigative journalism is dying and incredibly hard to do. It's time and money. I produced all of this on a virtual machine. I had a run.sh bash file that ran through all of my scripts. When I scraped everything from a website, the first thing I did was take a snapshot of the code that I downloaded with a timestamp on it. And so I basically told the corporations, and I told my editor, this is the file. Get the companies to get a developer to install VirtualBox and Vagrant and run everything that I've done. And within 2 minutes, I can reproduce the work that I've done. And the companies backed off. They backed off immediately. And that's another thing in terms of making decisions based on data is reproducibility. It's almost scientific. A lot of science is very, very difficult to reproduce. And if you're using big data, if you're making business decisions, oftentimes try and get someone even to reproduce partial data. If they're finding that difficult, then you have to worry that there's a bug. This was reproducible, and we had another metric that showed that it was logical. We weren't off by a factor of 10. And so that's why it was trustworthy. Prescriptions data. I am not proud of this story. I don't want you to judge it by the quality of the headline, okay? So bear with me. In the UK, one of our cleanest and largest data sets, because the NHS is owned by the government, they actually produce anonymized aggregated data of, it's not even aggregated, it's just anonymized data of prescriptions. It's 2 gigs every month. And so it's 60 gigs for the year. It's around 70 million lines of CSV file. So this is when I went to the Times. This prescriptions data had come out months previously, and no one had published anything on it. And I wondered why that was. It's because a single file which you download is 2 gigs, which is too big to open in Excel. That's exactly the answer. Also, they're working on really old Windows machines. They don't have enough RAM. So they were saying, yes, this is fantastic, it's great, but no one can open this. And I'm like, fine, just program this and go through it. So the prescriptions data, I actually managed to find 2 other data sets. The prescriptions data had a code for the drug type. Really done very, very well by the NHS, broken down and categorized for every single type of drug you can think of, the chemical component, and then basically what the symptoms are for. Fantastic data set. So I was able to get the prescriptions and able to, from the prescription data set, decide and know what type of drug was it being prescribed for. And then I found another very interesting data set. So each GP surgery, each doctor's surgery has a unique code on the NHS. And the prescriptions data had that code. But in another data set, I got the code, and I got the address. I also got a breakdown of their clients in terms of how many males, how many females, their age breakdowns as well. So I got a population breakdown. So I realized these massive data sets I can manipulate and join. So I was able to get prescriptions data down to the individual doctor's surgery minutiae. Telling the editors this, they wanted a map of erectile dysfunction drugs. Don't judge it by the story. Don't judge it by the story. That's the first thing they wanted to see. Mostly it was my fault because I was telling them how good the drugs database was. I was telling them, oh my God, the NHS, they've coded everything. We can get, anti-cancer drugs. We can get heart attack drugs. We get even erectile dysfunction. They're like, erectile dysfunction drugs. That's the ones we want. We later went, but this was the first use of the prescription story. So we got it down to GP level, and then we needed to get the male population in order to normalize the data, because we're getting this prescriptions which has to do based on populations. So the more concentrated the population, the harder the heat map. We would just be mapping the population. So we did normalize the data, and we did make a heat map. And we could make a heat map for tons and tons of different types of drugs, including ADHD drugs and other things a bit more interesting. That being said, hands up who thinks that is a legitimate story. Like, don't judge on the type of story. Legitimate story? Who here thinks it's a bug? Very few of you. It's actually a bug. But I didn't give you all the information. The clue was in the granularity. So we got individual doctor surgery, right? And some surgeries can be very small and have a small population. One of the doctor's surgeries is for the guards that guard the crown jewels in the Tower of London. These are yeomen. They're all quite old, as you can see. I'm not sure who they think they're going to stop stealing the crown jewels. But we were able to that was the doctor's surgery that had the highest concentration of erectile dysfunction drugs, because it was basically a doctor's surgery made of elderly men. And literally our editors wanted to go with the headline, Her Majesty's Limpest Service. We got into a massive, massive argument. I'm like, I know this data is open and it's free and it's government, we're allowed to use it, but we are breaking privacy laws. I ended up de-anonymizing it. I was like, no, you can isolate individuals from this. You cannot do this. You cannot do this. Even if the data is legit, if you have terms and conditions saying you guarantee anonymization, you guarantee privacy, if you de-anonymize it, you should not do that. You should not make business decisions off that. You just cannot do it. And so what we did is we had to then re-aggregate it up to a level where you cannot isolate it. So we went from GP level, we had to get mapping data onto constituencies and aggregate it further up there using mapping data. But that was a real key lesson to learn. It's actually a lot easier to de-anonymize data. And if you've de-anonymized data, it is a bug, it is not a story, you cannot use it. The next one I want to give you is actually using census data, which is a big, big data set, very, very clean, very, very trustworthy. One thing we did is we looked at the London population and UK-born citizens versus non-UK born. And then from there, our data scientists did a linear regression prediction that the non-UK born are going to outnumber the UK born people in London by 2028. The Times is a conservative paper. They were pro-Brexit. And they wanted to run with this. Hands up who thinks that that is a legitimate story. This is census data. Or bug. Yeah. It's a nasty, nasty bug. You should never, ever do predictions at all. Like, so many people use predictions and models for revenue. And it's basically they will pick whichever model gives them the most revenue. And it's absolutely useless. You should never make any decisions off that. Mostly, and the thing I use, not just that story and fighting our editors not to publish this and not to use this, and literally like whacking the data scientists over the head going, you knew you shouldn't have done this, just don't give it to them. Save them from themselves. The way I think about it is, I've seen 2 or 3 news articles actually saying that women are going to run faster than men using sports data. That being said, this is data. This is the men and women's 100 up at the top there. The blue is the men's, and that's the women. If you take a linear regression, if you take it over this snapshot in time, you will get that they will have done it by like 1950. And if you use this, you'll get it by like 2010. Whenever you use a linear regression, you have no idea when you should start with the data and when you should end. A census has a start and an end, but people and populations don't. There's also very, very different behaviors. So with men and sports and running, they've literally reached saturation point when it comes to how much like health and sports science and looking after their bodies they can. They're looking now for genetic freaks like Usain Bolt, who's just incredibly huge. Whereas women are in a different time frame with that. We still have way more that we can progress. And so we can be at a stage where it's linear, whereas men can be at a stage where it's a step, it's an instar. You do a linear regression, it makes absolutely no sense. Very different behaviors in the data. That being said, I'm going to go to the last one, which actually does use algorithms. This is the general election, the last general election. Even though we have a new prime minister, we haven't had a general election. But this is the last one, which got voted in. And we use the random forest algorithms to do a decision tree post-analysis of the breakdown of the type of constituencies that voted Labour, Conservative, or SNP. As you can see, the first thing is, are you in Scotland? If so, you most likely voted SNP. And that was using polling data, which in the UK isn't the best quality, but taking that into account is doing something like this legitimate as a story, as opposed to a linear regression. A random forest decision tree. Is it a story? Or is it a bug? I say this is a story. One, you're not making predictions. This is post-analysis. These are the decisions you want to make. You don't want to make a decision based on predicted revenue. You want to make a decision based on what led your revenue to be particularly what it was on certain days. Is it a sort of thing where there was an up in sales, or was it a weather thing? Then you should make these decisions based on that. The interesting thing for this as well is, even though it's algorithmic analysis, if anyone has used random forest, you can do pruning. There are actually quite a fair bit of decisions to make with this. So this is kind of a bit of a gray area. But one thing is we knew the data. We knew the story quite well. And secondly, the really interesting thing I liked about this as a story was, at first it was hugely difficult to persuade editors to do something like this. To them, this was very mathematical. They didn't like the idea of this. So what I actually did is, using Kaggle data and R, I did a random forest tree for the sinking of the Titanic. What was the biggest deciding factor for someone on the Titanic to have lived and have died? That's something they can understand. I showed them a bit of the steps, and I showed them the tree being made. And from that, they were like, okay, we can do this for the general election. We kind of understand it. So knowing how it works and applying it to something else and explaining that to people, explaining that to your business people, explaining that to your QA people, not leaving it in the realms of a developer and a data scientist, will lead you and the whole team to be able to make better decisions later on and interesting ways to use things. Because from that, they're allowed to do it for the general election. And my editor, who actually lives with me, actually said that when they knew Brexit was happening, when that vote was happening, she's like, the editors actually came to our team begging us to do this again. So, you know, it took ages to persuade them to do it. We did it once, and then afterwards they start coming back to you. That being said, I'm just about out of time. I'm Girl Meets Code. That's my ThoughtWorks address. Any questions? The fact that people who vote actually don't even look at policy very much leads me to think that this probably isn't going to influence them at all. The thing that it does interest me is how it might influence political parties and how they campaign. So the big inspiration for me to do that was Amanda Cox from the New York Times did a random forest algorithm decision tree for the previous Democratic primaries that was Obama versus Clinton. And they showed the decision tree of which states went for Obama, which states went for Clinton. And the one at the very top was, is it over 20% black population? Went straight for Obama. And so if you were thinking of electioneering like that, doing that post-analysis, you would concentrate on the nodes further down on the trees, on the switches that made a small percentage. Some of them had to do with education. And this thing had to do with society. And societies, the decision tree we did, it actually was more so who owns property. If they own their own property rather than actually being wealthy, that would change the way that they voted, which tells government, if you are in power and you want to stay in power, this is what you do, is you make sure more people are homeowners. Or for Clinton, you make sure you try and get deprived population to population in black areas more educated. And for me, that was what was interesting, because most of it was, there was always a positive way on society that led to the right outcome, the outcome of the people who got in. So that's where I think it would be interesting, and that's where I think it would be interesting in terms of businesses as well, doing the post-analysis on their data to decide how best to treat their customers. And there was a question over here as well. Oh. That's basically from training your nose, just from working with lots and lots of stuff. That's what I find a lot of data scientists who work with large data, they don't necessarily get the nose. Whenever I work with data, there's always something that I'm like, that just doesn't smell right. It's the same way as a journalist. Their kind of job on their beat is to kind of think, is this person bullshitting me? Or they're being really evasive. Maybe I should try around this route and get something. just from working with messy data, human-made data, government data on a small level. When you do it on a big level and you use Hadoop and Spark and you shard things, you don't get that view. Actually digging down into it, you just kind of get this sense, which is something like I particularly like doing. I think it's really, really fun and it's kind of problem solving. Another thing is, I didn't propose the talk for this strange loop, but I have done it previously, and I'm going to do it in Wharton Business School. I do a talk called Data Science Bullshit, which is all of the bullshit that you can come across of the pitfalls, and a lot of it has to do with just understanding like distributions, looking at data, that trying to find out how clean data is and how you can lose data, and it's just about working with it. What we realized was don't give it to them. Save it from themselves. We would keep it to a small group of people and then only allow what we think is legit in, because that's something we learned very early on, like with the prescriptions data and with things like that. We realized that once we presented them, they would just hook onto something. We would give them a broad overview, and it was like, no, just give them a narrow overview. That being said, one thing I realized is that if you leave the data knowledge and the statistical knowledge to the nerds, to the data scientists and the programmers, that's when it gets very, very dangerous, because they need also the knowledge of what is a legitimate business value. And as well as that, the people up high, they need to be able to try and spot issues in the data. They need to understand when things should be reproducible, because working with data and cleaning with data can be a real pain. And a lot of the times, corners are cut or things are missed, because you can pump something into an algorithm and it'll produce something out. It's not like you'll try and multiply two words and your compiler will just say, no, this makes no sense. There's so much stuff that you can do, and it will allow you to do. And it's just along the way, whether it makes sense from the way it was collected, the way it was cleaned. And so again, with my data science bullshit talk, what I kind of say is that this is not for developers, this is for QA and for business people, because they don't need to know the hard maths, but they need to know where the cracks are, that bad things tend to leak through. And that's what I found out, like working with data, even on a small or medium scale. Prescriptions was at most medium data. It wasn't even big data. It just wouldn't fit in like Excel. That's something that I've learned. But when you look at it on a large, large scale, you don't see the cracks. It just kind of smooths out. And so looking at things on a smaller scale just gives you that bit more sense. Anything else? I think we're just about done as well. Okay, tomorrow I'll be wearing my ThoughtWorks t-shirt, and I'll probably be at the ThoughtWorks booth as well. So come grab me if you have any questions or want to talk more.